If I asked you what the most well-known and memed on part of the entire Harry Potter series is, what would you say? The thing is, before you even answer, I already know what came to your mind. Because there is only one moment in the Goblet of Fire which will live on in infamy for the rest of history. Of course, I am speaking, very calmly mind you, about Dumbledore asking Harry if he put his name in the Goblet of Fire. Yes, this part of the movie is funny as it is such a drastic 180 from the Dumbledore that we're used to, but more than that, it opened the eyes for many fans to see just how different the movie can be from the book. And in my series, Movies vs. Manuscripts, I set out on a journey to find every single change, revision, and omission that the movie adaptations made to this beloved book series. And so far, we've covered the Philosopher's Stone, the Chamber of Secrets, and the Prisoner of Azkaban. And now, a few episodes into Harry's 4th year, we've finally come to the chapters that correspond to this iconic Dumbledore line. But it may surprise you to know that Dumbledore's line here isn't the only big change. In fact, there are nearly 3 chapters worth of information regarding the 24-hour period between the arrival of Beauxbatons in Durmstrang and the selection of the 4 champions. This 24-hour period is jam-packed with important details, character building, and much more. So join me today as I reveal every single change between these pages in the book and their adapted scenes in the film. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 48 of Movies vs. Manuscripts Harry Potter Edition. Before we get started, shout out to this commenter from a past episode. I'll address this more later on in the video, but thanks for contributing to the conversation. If you have any corrections, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below to potentially be featured in the next episode. Per usual, we'll be covering all the changes across the 4 major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's refresh our memory on what happened during this scene in the movie. That way, it's fresh on our mind as we cover all the changes. So, picking up from where we left off last week, we see it raining outside as students run indoors, and then we see the Goblet of Fire in the Great Hall as students put their names in for consideration. Ron and Harry look on as Cedric Diggory enters himself in, and then Fred and George run in soon after to cheers all around them. Hermione tells them that their aging potion won't work, but they tell her that it's so dim-witted it might just slide under the radar. So they take the potion, hop in the age line around the goblet, and celebrate as nothing happens immediately. But before they can celebrate too much more, they get shot back out of the circle and grow white beards, causing them to start fighting over their failure. Soon though, everyone's attention is drawn away from them as Victor Krum walks in and puts his name into the goblet. He gives Hermione a strange look and then walks out, leaving the movie to cut to later as Dumbledore begins the selection ceremony. The goblet then pops out a few names: Fleur Delacour, Victor Krum, and Cedric Diggory. But soon after Dumbledore reveals the Triwizard Champion trophy and everyone thinks the selections are done, Harry's name pops out as well. The students begin to whisper amongst themselves and call Harry out as a cheat as he heads forward to take his name from Dumbledore, who does not look too happy. He then heads down into the trophy room where the other 3 champions are located, and the school representatives hurry down after him, with Dumbledore barreling towards him and growling at him to see if he put his name into the Goblet of Fire. Harry tells him that he didn't, as Dumbledore slams him up against a trophy case, and after Harry's insistence that he didn't do it, Dumbledore relents. The heads of the visiting schools are not happy, but Moody backs Harry up, saying that Harry doesn't have the skill to trick the goblet. Then Barty Crouch determines that the rules are clear and Harry must compete. The movie then cuts to Dumbledore's office as he saves a memory of the night, and Snape suggests that they let events unfold. Then finally, we cut to Harry in his dorm as Ron gets upset and asks him how he put his name into the goblet. Harry denies doing it, and Ron doesn't believe him, causing them to go to bed angry after their first couple's fight. And that is where scenes end for this week. So although this is only a few minutes in the film, it's almost 3 whole chapters in the book, which means we've got a lot to cover. So let's not waste any time and jump right into the first 3 categories, which are characters, timeline, and location. First up for characters, we have quite a few people missing, per usual. But instead of listing out a million names, I'm just going to mention those with speaking parts or crucial roles that didn't make the film. And those people would be Angelina Johnson, Lee Jordan, Ludo Bagman, and then various other students with small lines such as Neville, Lavender, Dean, Seamus, and more. As for timeline, we have a bigger issue, which is that the movie completely ruined the book's school year by having the visiting schools arrive on the very first day and then the drawing happening soon after that. In the book, however, the visiting schools don't arrive until October 30th, which is 2 months after the start of term. And then the night that they arrive, the goblet is revealed and the students are given 24 hours to submit their names. Then at the Halloween feast on October 31st, the champions are selected. As you can see, this timeline is totally different in the film, and like I said earlier, today's video is all about covering the 24-hour period between the arrival of the schools and the selection of Harry as the 4th Triwizard Champion. Lastly, for our first 3 categories, we have locations, which similarly to characters could encompass about a dozen Hogwarts locations that are mentioned in the book but we never see in these scenes. However, to spare you from that tedious and mostly meaningless list, I have condensed it to the 2 locations that are important to today's episode, and those would be Hagrid's hut and the Gryffindor common room, neither of which get shown during this scene in the film. But now with those 3 categories complete, we can move on to our all-important plot changes. But as always, I wanted to shout out Jason, Joshua, Timothy, and the rest of my incredible Patreon supporters who help make these videos possible every month. Also, if you're interested in following along with me as I do this series, you can claim your free trial on Audible using the link in the description. It helps to support the channel, and you can get the Goblet of Fire audiobook for free and follow along with me as I do this series. Now, real quick, before we dive into the plot changes, I need to do something that I rarely do, which is make a complete retraction on a previous episode. That's right, Gibby was wrong, and you guys in the comments helped change my mind. Well, kind of. A couple episodes back, I talked about Harry's secret desire to enter and win the Triwizard Tournament. As always, I invite discussion in the comments, and boy oh boy, you guys came through letting me know that I missed the mark. And I 95% agree. You see, the difference is still there. Harry in the movie doesn't want any part of the tournament, and he makes that clear from the start. Book Harry, however, doesn't ever vocalize to Ron that he's against the tournament, because secretly he has multiple occasions where he fantasizes about winning. So there is that difference. But I neglected to mention a key part of inner dialogue which comes up later in the pages that we're covering today. And that is that after Harry's name is drawn, he mentally acknowledges that his previous fantasies weren't reality. And now that he's been chosen, he realizes that he doesn't want to be in the tournament. Now, perhaps this is because he knows someone else put his name in, which brings up a whole bunch of scary questions for him. Perhaps if he were 17 and could put his own name in, he would have. But those are just theories, and the reality is that he's pretty against the idea of participating once his name comes out of the goblet. So anyway, I just wanted to clear that up, that way we all could be on the same page. And now with that being said, we can move on to the plot changes. Starting things off today, we need to talk about something that we already saw in the movie. Obviously, we covered their start of term feast a couple episodes back, and that is when the movie introduces us to Durmstrang and Beauxbatons. Which, by the way, you might hear me say Beauxbatons or Beauxbatons because I don't know how to say it. I've heard some of you guys in the comments say that in French it would be Beauxbaton, but Dumbledore in the movie says Beauxbaton, and I'm not French or British, so I don't know how I'm gonna say it. But just be prepared for me to go back and forth. Anyway, like I mentioned in the timeline section, the book has a different version of when these 2 schools arrive, which is on October 30th. With this arrival, there are a few key revisions and omissions. First, the movie only shows the carriage flying in and the boat arriving, but not what happens after. In the book, we read about how the students all gawked as they watched Madame Maxine leave her carriage. Obviously, she's the only other person they've ever seen who is as big as Hagrid. Dumbledore greets her, and then she leads her students inside of Hogwarts. Then Durmstrang arrives, and the Hogwarts students watch as Karkaroff greets Dumbledore and then brings Viktor Krum into the light. And that is where chapter 15 ends, with Ron's jaw on the floor as he sees his favorite Quidditch player. Now obviously this means that there is a second difference here, and that is the fact that there is no grand entrance from the schools with a dance routine or whatever we see in the movie. That's a little overdramatic on the film's part, and in reality it's way more simple. They just get out and head inside for dinner. Also, we see the carriage and boat arrive during the day in the movie, but the schools don't enter the Great Hall until dinner, which is at nighttime. So that suggests that the visiting schools arrived and just stayed hidden in their vessels until dinner, which is just weird. Anyway, moving on to dinner itself, we have one crucial omission the movie made, and that is the first time that Ron meets Fleur. In the book, we read that the Beauxbatons group seemed really stuck up and didn't like Hogwarts very much, whereas the Durmstrang group seemed very intrigued by the castle. During dinner, one of the girls had taken off her muffler finally and let her hair fall, and then she came over to Ron to ask for one of the dishes that he had at his table. Ron sees her and loses the ability to speak, looking like a fool. This girl is of course Fleur, and after she leaves, Ron comes back to his senses and insists that she's part Vila, which Hermione says is ridiculous. although we'll find out later in the book that Fleur being part Vila isn't as crazy as it seems. Now remember, technically in the book, the Goblet of Fire hasn't been revealed yet. It is after this dinner on October 30th that Dumbledore reveals it and then gives all the students 24 hours to put their names in. The announcement he makes is similar to the one we saw earlier in the film, but what the movie never showed was them leaving dinner and Harry's run-in with Karkaroff. That's right, after finishing up and heading out of the Great Hall, Harry holds the door for Karkaroff, who looks at his scar and stops dead in his tracks. This causes a scene as all the Durmstrang lot stop and stare as they realize who Harry is. Thankfully, Mad-Eye Moody saves the day as he approaches and tells Karkaroff to move along, and the Durmstrang professor reacts very oddly to seeing Moody there. This clues us in on the state of their relationship, which will play a role later on in the book. But now with those first few changes out of the way, we can finally move into the next morning as we talk about everything that happened on that Saturday and of course the selection ceremony. First up, we need to address the twins' attempt to enter the tournament. We read that in the morning, the trio woke up earlier than usual to go to breakfast, and most of the other students had the same idea, as in the entrance hall the Goblet of Fire was set up, and everyone wanted a clear view of who was putting their names in. As the trio arrive, Ron asked a random third-year girl who had already put their names in, and we hear that all the Durmstrang lot already did, but no one from Hogwarts it seems. At that moment, Fred and George Weasley and Lee Jordan all come running into the hall holding their aging potions. Which is our first change here, as obviously the movie completely cut Lee. But in the book, we learn that they meant to enter together, and Lee even says that the three of them made an agreement to split the money if any of them won. Luckily for Lee though, he didn't get the same punishment as the twins for trying to enter, as they don't all jump in at the same time, which brings us to our next change. Unlike the movie, Fred and George go one at a time to test their theory. Fred enters first and stands there for a second, completely unharmed. This prompts George to jump in and do the same, but before Lee can be the third one to join, Fred and George get booted out and sprout beards. However, not only is that moment changed, but the aftermath is as well. You see, first of all, Fred and George are laughing at their misfortune, probably because they know that they did it to themselves, and they can respect Dumbledore for this fitting punishment with the beards. But also, Dumbledore himself appears and begins laughing at them. He tells them that they have very fine beards, but they aren't the only ones. So far, Madame Pomfrey has had to tend to multiple other students who have tried crossing the age line. So Fred and George run off with Lee to head to the hospital wing, cackling all the way. Next up, I want to mention something that's a little more abstract than a specific moment, and that is the Gryffindor's dislike of Cedric Diggory, or I should say, the boys in Harry's year. As the trio go to breakfast, Ron and Seamus talk about who's entered, and Seamus also seems to be on board with Ron's way of thinking about how Cedric shouldn't be the Hogwarts champion. Seamus even calls him Pretty Boy Diggory. Now obviously they don't hate him, but they'd much rather have a Gryffindor champion, and they're quite jealous of how popular Cedric is. This is completely the opposite of the movie, as we see Ron try to suck up to Cedric, and even in this scene he awkwardly waves at him as he passes by. But in the book, Ron, Seamus, and most of the Gryffindor boys are quite loud about how they don't want Cedric as their champion, which brings a few scowls from the Hufflepuff tables. Now moving on to the next change, we have the omission of Angelina Johnson, who enters to be the Hogwarts champion. This excites the Gryffindors as they watch her submit her name, because then at least a Gryffindor has a chance to be included. Another change with the Goblet here in the morning is that the trio watch as Madame Maxine forms a line with all of her students, and they one by one enter their names into the Goblet. Remember, the visiting schools didn't bring all of their students, they only brought a specific delegation. And I believe in the book that the idea is that every student who came also entered into the tournament. It's not just Krum and Fleur who entered. And later we'll see that Fleur wasn't necessarily the popular pick for her school. But before we get to the selection ceremony, we first need to address one last omission regarding how the trio spent their time before dinner. You see, in the book, we read that they decided to go visit Hagrid, since they hadn't done that so far this year. So they went down to his hut and ended up spending the whole day with him, reluctantly eating lunch that he prepared, which wasn't at all suitable for consumption. In general, they just talk with him about the tournament and school so far, but one of the most important parts of dialogue to come from this time in the hut is when Hermione asks Hagrid to join Spew. She takes down a badge for him, expecting him of all people to be on board, but Hagrid refuses. He tells Hermione that the elves enjoy their lives and want to serve humans. If you take that away from them, then they wouldn't be happy. Hermione brings up Dobby as an example though, and Hagrid says that every group will have some crazies amongst them, but Hermione will be hard-pressed to convince the majority of house elves to quit their jobs. But anyway, beyond this part of the conversation, there's only one other moment key to this time with Hagrid. After spending the day with him, it gets about time to head up to the castle for dinner, and Hagrid sprays something on himself, which makes the trio disgusted. Hagrid embarrassingly says that it's cologne and asks if it's too much. He then dunks his head in water outside to get rid of the smell, and then he sees Madame Maxine, who just exited the carriage which is parked near his hut. Hagrid then walks over to Madame Maxine and walks with her up to the castle, completely forgetting about the trio who are still in his home. The trio watch all of this and realize that Hagrid is interested in Madame Maxine, and as book fans know, this relationship starts here and blossoms into something much larger than this one movie, as Madame Maxine is involved with Hagrid even into the next book. But that's a story for next season of Movies vs. Manuscripts. Anyway, to get back to this week's episodes, we finally come to the champion selection ceremony and our final few changes. First up, you know how I mentioned Fleur wasn't the popular pick? Well, unlike the movie, which seems to pin Krum and Fleur as the main characters of their schools, the book describes Fleur as one of many students who were vying for the position. And after her name comes out of the goblet, we read that a few other girls broke down crying that they weren't selected. J.K. Rowling is obviously hammering home the idea that Beauxbatons is a lot more vain than Hogwarts or Durmstrang, as Fleur's fellow students are more jealous than supportive. Now, besides this minor change with Fleur, Cedric and Krum's selections are very similar between book and movie. This gives us our 3 champions, and they all gather in the side room next to the Great Hall. And just like in the movie, Harry's name pops out, causing the room to go quiet. But our next change is of course what you all came here for. It's the meme of the millennia, the goof of the goblet, the fumble of Dumble. And of course I'm talking about Dumbledore asking if Harry put his name in the Goblet of Fire. And the change is that he says it calmly in the book. I know, you already knew that, but my job is to list every single change, so I'd be doing a disservice if I skipped it. Other than that, there really isn't much to say here. The only other thing I can talk about brings us into our next change, which is that the movie removed a lot more context surrounding this moment in an attempt to condense things for the film. In the book, Dumbledore doesn't actually ask Harry this question until everyone else has spoken. Fleur is upset at this, sticking to the Beauxbatons attitude, Krum is confused, and Cedric is indifferent. But Karkaroff and Madame Maxine are livid. They came to Hogwarts trusting in a fair competition. Of course, they now see what looks like a plot masterminded by Dumbledore. If Hogwarts has 2 champions, they have higher odds of winning. Karkaroff and Madame Maxine voice this quite clearly in their anger, and after Dumbledore calms them down a little bit, he asks Harry if he put his name in. Harry says no, and no one but Dumbledore seems to believe him. Also, it's key to mention that another part of the movie that was omitted was Ludo Bagman's involvement. In the book, Barty Crouch isn't the only Ministry of Magic official helping to organize the event, as Ludo Bagman is the head of magical games and sports. So Ludo walks in and he's ecstatic. Of course, if you know Ludo, you know that he loves anything that would make it more fun and lively. And what better way to excite the games than throw in an unexpected 4th champion? But Ludo never wants to be perceived as the bad guy, so he defaults to Barty's judgment. And just like in the movie, Barty explains that the goblet is binding and Potter must compete. Of course, Karkaroff and Madame Maxine hate this, and they say that they'll be filing formal complaints with the Ministry of Magic and the International Confederation of Wizards. Fleur then shows her diva side again as she stamps her feet and complains about how this is a chance people would die for, and Potter got it unfairly. Then Moody interjects and says perhaps someone is hoping Potter is going to die for it, and this causes a tense silence to fall over the group. Now, there is much more dialogue in here that I can't dive into today, so again, I encourage you to pick up the audiobook on Audible, but I think you get the picture. The movie doesn't do this moment justice, and specifically, we see this more in the next change, which is the fact that the entire scene of Dumbledore saving the memory in his pensieve is made up. While one could argue that the previous moment I discussed was cut for time, it's hard to see that when the movie adds a scene like this for no reason. This isn't in the book, so technically, if they didn't include it, then maybe they could have expanded on the conversation that happens after Harry gets selected. Anyway, our second to last change is a small moment after the discussion about our 4 champions, in which Dumbledore invites everyone for a nightcap. He specifically asks Barty to join, but Barty says he can't as he has a lot of work to do at the Ministry. This is hinting at more than their usual work, as the Ministry, and Barty specifically, is dealing with much more than his usual workload. And I can't wait until a future episode to discuss Barty Crouch's relationship with his son and the nature of his junior's escape from Azkaban. So keep an eye out for that. But now to end things off for today, we have our final change, which is the fact that the movie didn't include anything about the Gryffindors throwing a party for Harry. You see, although Ron was upset, the rest of the Gryffindors were ecstatic, and when Harry arrived back in the common room, he was greeted by cheering and applause. Even Angelina Johnson is happy for Harry. Ultimately, the Gryffindors are happy that a fellow Gryffindor is representing Hogwarts, and not just Cedric. We read that they partied late into the night, and no matter how many times Harry tried to sneak away, the other students would corner him or drag him back into the party. So finally, by the time he got up to bed where Ron was waiting for him, his best friend was quite upset. Harry and Ron then talk, and it's pretty similar to the movie, just more extended as book dialogue usually is. So I won't get into that. However, I really do think the movie downplayed the whole part about how proud the Gryffindors were of Harry. They all thought he fooled Dumbledore's age line, which made them respect him even more. In the movie, it just seems like a lot of the students, including the Gryffindors, are against Harry and they support Cedric instead. But that's just not true in the book. But anyway, that wraps up all of our changes for this week. If you enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Also, leave your thoughts in the comments below to potentially be featured in the next episode. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.